The shutters were always drawn, even at midday. Neighbors said it was to keep out the heat, but others whispered that light itself was not permitted to enter that house. Children hurried past its gates, clutching their mothers' skirts, while the older men of Royal Street lowered their voices whenever its mistress's name was spoken. Still, life in the quarter pressed on. Music spilled from taverns, market wives shouted their prices in sing-song cadence, and magnolia blossoms perfumed the air. Against this brightness, the darkened facade of the Duval residence loomed heavier with every season, a shadow stitched into the heart of New Orleans. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The year was 1834, a year etched now not for commerce or festivity, but for revelation. To the casual visitor, nothing seemed amiss. Royal Street gleamed with its balconies hung in flowers. The clatter of carriage wheels mingled with laughter, and every Sunday the cathedral bells tolled steady above the square. Madame Celestine Duval, tall and pale, was still seen riding through town in her lacquered carriage, nodding politely as she passed acquaintances. She wore pearls at her throat, gloves of the finest lace, and a smile practiced so carefully it concealed every crease of age or worry. To speak plainly, the family appeared untouchable, old wealth, French breeding, manners that never faltered. If questions arose about the servants who were seldom seen, or the sounds that drifted late from the upper windows, they were dismissed as inventions of jealousy. In a city where every household concealed its secrets, who could cast the first stone, yet unease collected all the same. Accounts recorded at the time mentioned muffled cries mistaken for song, shadows flitting across shuttered rooms, and odors too sharp for any kitchen fire. One neighbor swore that when she leaned from her balcony at dusk, she could hear the rattle of chains, faint like wind chimes, but human in their cadence. She confessed this only years later, ashamed she had not spoken sooner. The Duval mansion had been erected in grandeur. 3 stories, wrought iron balconies curling like vines, its plaster walls painted the color of pale cream. By day, it seemed merely another jewel in the quarter's crown. But by night it became forbidding. Lantern light never touched its windows, and the silence around its gates grew so complete that even drunkards staggered past with lowered heads. In her journals, a seamstress employed briefly by the household wrote of being summoned at odd hours to repair gowns. She was made to wait long in the parlor, where curtains were drawn tight. The air was stifling, she noted, and I fancied I heard movements in the walls. Once she glimpsed through a cracked door a narrow corridor lit by a single candle. A figure moved there, not Madame, not a servant she recognized, but thin, stooped, with wrists bound in some kind of clasp. She never returned, excusing herself with illness. If these stories had remained scattered, they might have dissolved like old rumors in a busy city. But repetition wore them into shape. By the early months of 1834, whispers collected into something more persistent, and though respectable society laughed away such talk, the fear lingered, growing heavy as the air itself. April came, humid and fragrant, its evenings drawn out by the glow of gaslight. The city prepared for another season of gatherings and dances, and still the Duval house remained shuttered. Madame Celestine was glimpsed only in carriage or church pew, never on foot. Her husband, Dr. Henry Duval, was spoken of less. Some said he had taken ill and kept to his study. Others said he conducted experiments best not mentioned in polite company. It is here the record grows conflicted. Some claim he was seen purchasing medical instruments not intended for household use, siren restraints, scalpels, peculiar glass vessels. Others claim he had vanished entirely, his absence covered by his wife's poise. None could say for certain, for the Duval gates remained closed, the servants silent, and so as the quarter moved through that fateful spring, it carried with it a contradiction, gaiety ringing in the streets, dread festering in its shadows. Children skipped rope beneath balconies blooming with geraniums, while in hushed corners of taverns men muttered that something unnatural was alive on Royal Street. The mansion stood unmoved, its shutters sealed, its mistress unflinching, its silence spreading like a contagion through the very stones of the neighborhood. The city itself became a cocons, conspirator, bound not by chains of iron but by the softer, crueler chains of fear. Even then, before the fire, before the doors were broken down and the attic revealed, one could sense the tension, as if the walls of that house strained to hold back something too long concealed. That is how it always begins, with silence mistaken for order, with manners disguising cruelty, with neighbors convincing themselves that the stench in the air is merely the wind off the river. But history would not let the Duval's silence endure. The truth was already pressing at the walls, ready to burn its way into the open. The first breach in silence came not from a neighbor, nor from any official, but from within the household itself. In early accounts, scribbled notes from the parish constable, testimony whispered at taverns, there is mention of a young servant girl, scarcely more than 15, who vanished from the Duval estate. Her name, Jean, appears only once in the records, attached to a small payment made to her kin after her fall. The story went that Jean had leapt from the third-floor balcony, her body breaking upon the flagstones below. Madame Celestine declared it an accident, and the matter seemed poised to dissolve into obscurity. But those who saw her body whispered otherwise. The girl's wrists bore marks as though bound, and her back showed bruises in symmetrical patterns no fall could have caused. The neighbors had long suspected cruelty, but this was proof too raw to ignore. Still, in the custom of the time, deference outweighed outrage. The Duvals were wealthy, refined. Their word carried more weight than any servant's suffering. And so the death was written away, buried under candlelight ceremonies and the soft hush of coin. Yet the cracks widened. By March of 1834, strange odors emanated more frequently from the Duval mansion. Accounts describe a pungency like scorched iron, mixed with something sweeter, rancid, clinging to clothes and hair long after one had passed the gates. One man, a cooper by trade, claimed he smelled it even from his own balcony half a street away. Children reported hearing groans at night, low, guttural, too heavy for wind. Parents hushed them, insisting it was imagination, yet some began avoiding Royal Street after dark. There is a note in Father Moreau's parish diary, the people murmur of the Duval house. I counsel patience, but even my own steps falter when I near it. The Lord does not dwell there. Madame Celestine carried on as though untouched. She hosted dinners in her glittering parlor, entertained officials with her polished French, rode each Sunday to Mass with gloved hands resting calmly in her lap. Guests, though charmed, often recorded feeling a strange chill in her company. One remarked, she smiled, yet her eyes did not bend with the smile. It was a mask fixed too tightly upon her face. Servants rarely appeared in public. When they did, they walked stiffly, their eyes lowered, voices hushed. The market, women muttered that the Duval slaves seemed thinner each month, their clothing more ragged, as though provisions never reached them. Yet no one confronted the mistress directly. Fear held their tongues. The house itself seemed to drink in the tension. Its shutters remained sealed even in suffocating heat. Delivery boys told of knocking at the gate and waiting long minutes before anyone answered. When the iron latch finally creaked, a pale hand would extend to snatch parcels inside, the gate slamming closed before a word could be exchanged. By April, the unease had hardened into dread. It was no longer one neighbor or two whispering, but entire streets. Rumors spread that the attic was used for punishments, that iron instruments clanged within at night. Some even claimed to see fleeting figures pressed against the windows, faces too gaunt, too strained to belong to any guest. In retrospect, the fire seems inevitable. No structure can contain such weight of cruelty forever. But before the flames, there was still a final attempt at silence, a last performance of refinement. Invitations went out for a dinner party at the Duval mansion, scheduled for the second week of April, 1834. Several families of stature were listed among the guests. Preparations filled the house. Carriages delivered crates of wine, fresh game, baskets of fruit and herbs. Servants hurried in and out, their steps hurried, their faces drawn, and yet, beneath the bustle, there lingered something unsteady. Witnesses described the kitchen fire that week as burning too hot, smoke trailing strangely through the upper windows instead of the chimneys. The cook, an older woman known in the quarter, confided to a neighbor that she prayed each day for release. Days later, she vanished entirely. The night of the gathering never arrived. Instead, an inferno did. The blaze began, so it was said, in the kitchen, a sudden roar of flame leaping up the dry wood beams. Whether sparked by carelessness, desperation, or rebellion, none could later prove. But once ignited, the fire spread fast, carried by wind and heat, curling up stairwells and choking corridors. Neighbors, startled by the scent of burning pitch, raised the alarm. In the quarter, fire was every household's terror. One spark could reduce blocks to cinders. Bucket lines formed, shouts rang out, men raced toward the Duval house. Women clutched their children, staring in horror as smoke belched from shuttered windows. The Duval doors remained shut. Cries were heard within, not the panicked shouts of a household fleeing flames, but sounds deeper, more terrible, moans of prolonged suffering, voices that seemed to have been waiting for this very moment to be released. Axes were fetched, hinges groaned, and when at last the doors splintered inward, the truth long whispered, long denied, was forced into the open. The fire revealed what silence had buried. When the doors of the Duval mansion were forced open, smoke curled outward like a living thing, thick and choking, but even thicker were the sounds that spilled with it. Wails, ragged cries, the wet rasp of throats too long denied air. Men staggered back, crossing themselves, their axes clattering at their feet. They had expected to find only fire, perhaps panic among the servants. What they discovered was something else entirely. The grand hall, once glittering with chandeliers and marble, had become a furnace. Flames licked at velvet draperies and crawled hungrily along polished banisters. Yet it was not the fire that froze the rescuers, but what the fire revealed. From behind locked doors at the end of the corridor came pounding, frantic, as though fists had waited years to strike. Voices shrieked, some pleading, some unintelligible, others so hoarse they were scarcely human. The men forced their way through smoke and heat until they reached a bolted door. With blows of iron and wood they shattered it, and there the vision opened fully. The attic, the chamber of whispers, lay before them. Accounts differ in the particulars, but all agree on the horror. There were chains fixed to the walls, iron collars dangling, ropes stiff with dried stains. Instruments no one could name stood like grotesque furniture. Iron frames bent to unnatural angles, wooden planks splintered from strain, contraptions that seemed to blur the line between tool and torture. And among these, the living, half-starved figures huddled in corners, eyes reflecting firelight in terror. Some bore shackles that bit into raw flesh, others carried wounds festering from neglect. One woman staggered forward, her skin blistered, her voice a cracked whisper begging for release. A man was found stretched upon a board, his limbs bound so long they seemed twisted from their natural shape. Another clutched at rescuers, his wrists grotesquely scarred by years of restraint. The rescuers faltered. They had come to fight fire, not to face a vision of damnation. Some retched where they stood, others wept openly. Yet still they moved, cutting chains, carrying bodies from smoke to air. Neighbors gathered in the street recoiled at the sight, mothers pressing children against their skirts, men swearing oaths of vengeance. Not all victims survived the night. Several, too weakened, collapsed in the very moment of freedom. But those who lived bore testimony etched in flesh more damning than any spoken word. The fire raged on, devouring chamber after chamber. Yet it was clear, even then, that flames were not the greatest destruction within those walls. What burned most fiercely was illusion. The image of refinement of silks and pearls collapsed before the eyes of the city. The Duval house, so long admired, was revealed as a place of torment. Word spread with impossible speed. By dawn, taverns from one end of the quarter to the other roared with the tale. Priests spoke of sin from their pulpits, their voices trembling. Market stalls buzzed with fragments of description, chains, screams, the smell of rot mingled with smoke. The city itself seemed to shudder, unable to contain the enormity of what had been uncovered, and yet, amidst the chaos, one detail stood out, repeated again and again with growing fury. Madame Celestine Duval was nowhere to be found. Some swore she had been seen moments before the fire spread, standing at the top of the stairs, her gown immaculate despite the smoke, her expression serene. Others claimed she fled before the first alarm was sounded, vanishing into the night with jewels sewn into her hem. A few whispered that a carriage had been waiting in the alley, its wheels rattling over cobblestones as it sped into darkness. Whatever the truth, she did not appear among the rescuers, nor among the victims. The woman who had presided over refinement by day and cruelty by night had slipped from sight in the very hour her secrets burned into the open. The crowd outside, once frantic with fear of fire, turned quickly to rage. They surged against the gates, pressing toward the mansion not to fight flames but to claim vengeance. Windows shattered under thrown stones, doors splintered under axes. Rooms already blackened by fire were further ruined by fury. Chandeliers were torn down, portraits ripped to shreds, mirrors smashed until the floors glittered with fragments. It was not merely destruction. It was ritual, a purging of complicity. For years, neighbors had admired the Duval elegance, had bowed politely at church and smiled at soirees, even as rumors whispered through the quarter. Now their silence felt unbearable. Every blow of hammer and stone was a confession, every shattered wall a plea for absolution. The mansion groaned under the onslaught. Flames consumed its bones even as the crowd tore away its flesh. By the night's end, only a skeleton of brick and smoke remained, a ruin looming over Royal Street, its grandeur reduced to ash. Yet destruction did not bring peace. The people stared into the flames and felt no closure, for the mistress of the house was gone. Justice had been denied the face it most sought, and so the legend began, not of the mansion's fall, but of her escape. The fire had stripped the house of secrecy, but the mob stripped it of dignity. By the time dawn broke, the Duval mansion was no longer a residence, but a carcass, smoldering on Royal Street. Its windows gaped like sockets from which eyes had been gouged. The air reeked of wet ash and iron, with a bitter undercurrent of blood. The city gathered to stare, first in silence, then in furious murmurs that grew into shouts. All spoke of Madame Celestine. Where was she? How had she slipped away? No one could answer, and in that void certainty was abandoned for speculation. Some swore they had seen her carriage hurtling down Chartres Street, the driver urging the horses to madness, armed men riding beside it to shield her from the mob. Others dismissed it as fancy, claiming no carriage wheels had rung on the stones that night, that her disappearance was too sudden, too complete. To them she had become less woman than phantom, vanishing as if swallowed by smoke itself. What was undeniable was her absence. The city had been robbed of the sight it most hungered for. To drag her before the ruin of her own house, to demand answers, to see remorse or at least terror in her eyes. Denied this, the anger of the people turned inward, burning in taverns, pews, and marketplaces alike. The ruins drew them back. Day after day, men and women returned to the blackened gates, staring into the wreckage as though the ashes might yield her face. Children dared each other to climb the steps, swearing they heard chains still rattling within. Some carried away shards of wood or glass, tokens of the night they had witnessed, relics of horror to hide in pockets or beneath beds. The ruin became not merely a house, but a wound, raw and weeping, in the heart of New Orleans, and with the ruin came stories. One version of her fate insisted she had boarded a ship that very night, bound for Paris, her name shielded by wealth and her passage purchased in haste. Others claimed she had not left the countryside at all, but remained hidden on plantations owned by allies too powerful to fear retribution. Some whispered she disguised herself, adopting a new name, walking openly among those who had once bowed to her without ever recognizing her face. The uncertainty of her fate deepened the wound. Without her capture, justice was a hollow word, and the city seethed. Sermons thundered with condemnation, but also with unease. Could a woman who commanded such cruelty truly be contained by law? Or had she struck her bargain with darker powers, escaping in ways no carriage or ship could explain? Those who had seen the attic first hand became unwilling prophets. They described in gasping tones the sound of locks broken, the sight of shackles gleaming red in firelight, the smell that clung to their clothes long after. Their stories spread, repeating in taverns, markets, and parlors until the line between memory and legend blurred. By their voices, Madame Celestine became more than a woman. She became a specter, a shadow haunting the quarter, proof that evil refined by pearls and lace could not be bound by earthly hands. The ruin itself fed the legend. For months it stood, a charred skeleton on Royal Street. Passers-by crossed to the opposite side rather than risk its shadow. Carriage horses shied violently when their drivers drew too near. Even in daylight, the air around the mansion felt heavy, suffocating, as though the walls still drank in the cries of those who had suffered within. When masons at last came to rebuild, their hammers struck stone in silence. Men who had sung at other work sites labored here without a word. One dropped his tools and fled after hearing chains rattle in an empty corridor. Another swore that a moan rose beneath the scrape of his chisel. Though the house rose again, reshaped by new hands, it never lost the taint. Its walls seemed to hold shadows that daylight could not dispel. Tenants came and went. A family who dared the restored rooms reported waking to dragging chains in the night. At first they thought it thieves, but no window was forced, no lock disturbed. The noises grew until the father declared he would sooner see his children sleep in the street than endure another hour inside. They fled before dawn, abandoning what belongings they could not carry. Others spoke of laughter echoing in the upper floors, sharp and mocking, though no one was there. Some swore they recognized the voice, high, triumphant, unmistakable, as though Celestine herself mocked those who thought she could be banished. A woman who lodged briefly in the house insisted she woke to see a figure at the foot of her bed, a silhouette with eyes burning white. When she screamed, the vision vanished, but she left the house by morning light and never again walked Royal Street. Even those who never entered felt its curse. Passers-by claimed phantom candles flickered in its windows long after the rooms had been abandoned. Carriage drivers avoided its gates, muttering prayers under their breath. Children dared one another to touch the iron bars, only to recoil, swearing they felt cold seep into their bones as though the metal itself remembered shackles. The Duval house became a boundary between the living and the dead, a scar no paint could conceal. Owners tried to dress it in fresh colors, to fill it with laughter or hymns, but each attempt failed. Shadows returned, laughter cut through silence, chains rattled faintly in the dark. Tenants fled in terror, leaving rooms empty, leaving silence more eloquent than testimony. By the middle of the century, it was legend as much as house. Guides spoke of it in hushed tones, pointing to its windows as tourists clutched shawls tighter. Locals muttered that it was cursed, that no soul could dwell there without being haunted by those who had died in chains. Some said it was the captives whose spirits lingered, restless and unappeased. Others believed it was Madame Celestine herself, tethered to the site of her cruelty, laughing in triumph that she had escaped justice in life and could not be cast out in death. The Duval mansion did not heal. Its walls had soaked too deeply in suffering. To step inside was to feel the weight of agony pressing on the chest, suffocating as though the house itself resented intrusion. Skeptics dismissed the tales as superstition, yet even they admitted unease when walking past its gates. The curse, whether real or imagined, was undeniable in its persistence, and so the ruin endured, not as a home but as a scar. Where other houses blossomed with new life, this one remained only whispers and fear. For those who lived in its shadow, the curse was not amusement but reminder. That cruelty leaves stains no time can wash away, that walls can hold screams, and that some wounds, once cut into a city, never heal. Time passed, but the name Duval remained lodged in the marrow of New Orleans. It was spoken in whispers at first, then in sermons, and finally in pamphlets printed by those eager to profit from the public's fascination. Stories multiplied, some tethered to truth, others inflated by the fever of rumor until they teetered between history and legend. Yet beneath all the fabrications, one certainty endured. The family's shadow did not recede with the flames. Clerks in parish offices unearthed brittle ledgers, their ink faded but legible, bearing witness to transactions that now seemed sinister. Ship manifests recorded the arrival of chained bodies purchased by the Duvals, entries written with the same casual hand that noted barrels of sugar or crates of silks. Wills and inventories revealed fortunes built not only upon commerce but upon suffering, each line item a monument to cruelty preserved in paper. Scholars, eager to dissect what the city preferred to forget, gathered these fragments. They examined handwriting, debated signatures, and pored over diaries once hidden in attics or pawned for coins. Some fixated on Madame Celestine's correspondence, noting how her letters fluttered between refinement and command. A single line praising the scent of roses might be followed by instructions for chains to be reinforced or supplies of laudanum replenished. Her handwriting, they claimed, betrayed a duality, elegant, looping flourishes masking the coldness of instruction. Doctors, too, intruded upon the narrative, their pens steeped in the language of pseudoscience. They wrote of female hysteria, of hereditary madness flowing through the blood of aristocratic families, of the peculiar mania that drove refinement to rot. Their journals speculated that Celestine suffered from what they termed moral insanity, an illness not of the body but of the soul, leaving her capable of cruelty without remorse. Some declared she had inherited it from her father, a merchant whispered to have been ruthless in trade. Others argued it was the effect of New Orleans itself, a city of heat, shadow, and secrecy that fermented cruelty in those who indulged too deeply in its pleasures. Yet these analyses, cloaked in the language of medicine, read more like confessions of obsession. One physician recorded measurements of skulls he claimed had belonged to captives unearthed in the garden. He traced the curves and angles with trembling fingers, insisting they proved the science of phrenology, that the enslaved had been destined for suffering and Celestine for dominance. Another doctor argued the opposite, declaring her skull, had it been recovered, would have revealed the moral cavities of depravity. Both men sought proof where proof was unnecessary. The house itself, the ruin, and the voices of survivors were testimony enough. Genealogists, too, joined the frenzy. They charted the Duval lineage across parchment sheets, tracing connections to merchants in Paris, soldiers in Saint-Domingue, and financiers in Madrid. They hunted for the seed of madness, pointing to a grandfather who vanished during a revolt, a cousin whispered to have drowned a servant, a mother whose melancholy was recorded in a single line of a priest's diary. Each thread was drawn tighter, as if the sins of Celestine could be explained by ancestry rather than choice. But for every scholar who sought reason, there were storytellers who stoked the supernatural. Pamphlets sold in the markets claimed Celestine had studied grimoires smuggled from Europe, that her cruelty was less a defect of mind than a pact with shadowed forces. They printed wood, cut illustrations of her carriage, wheels aflame, vanishing into a night sky streaked with demons. Ballads were sung in taverns, voices rising over clattering mugs, insisting she could not die, that she walked still, veiled and mocking, through the quarter. The city, eager both to condemn and to be entertained, consumed these accounts hungrily. Respectable families read them in parlors, muttering that such depravity must never be forgotten, even as their children trembled at every creak in the rafters. Priests thundered from pulpits that her flight was proof of divine justice delayed, that sin so monstrous could not escape eternal reckoning. And yet, outside the churches, men whispered that perhaps she had indeed returned in disguise, her wealth sheltering her in plain sight. The survivors, scattered and broken, rarely spoke. Their silence was louder than the pamphlets. When pressed, some described the attic as a place where time itself unraveled, where days bled into nights without mercy. One man, his wrists still scarred, said he no longer feared death because he had already lived in its mouth. A woman, her eyes clouded, insisted she still heard footsteps above her at night, though her ceiling was bare. Their words did not travel as quickly as the pamphlets, but they lingered heavier in the air, undeniable to those who heard them. As decades passed, the Duval mansion became both history and myth, dissected by scholars, romanticized by pamphleteers, and cursed by neighbors. The city itself seemed unable to decide whether to bury the story or to parade it. Guides pointed to the charred gates for coin. Priests muttered prayers as they passed. Children dared each other to touch the walls, then fled shrieking when the bricks felt colder than stone should. What began as whispers grew into a framework of legend, stitched by fact, rumor, and superstition alike. The Duvals were no longer merely a family. They became a parable, proof that wealth could conceal horror, that refinement could cloak rot, and that evil, once birthed, did not perish easily. The scholars who pursued the family with ink and theories sought to close the wound with explanations. Yet their diagrams, their skulls, their genealogies did little to ease the unease that clung to Royal Street. If anything, they deepened it, for the more they sought to rationalize Celestine's cruelty, the more they revealed how little reason could explain. What lay in that attic was not the product of science, inheritance, or mania alone. It was choice, deliberate and sustained, cultivated behind silk curtains and chandeliers. And so, each record uncovered, each study printed, each pamphlet sold became part of a larger truth. The legend of Madame Celestine Duval was not confined to her lifetime. It was an infection that spread through ink, voice, and memory, ensuring that long after her carriage vanished into the night, her shadow remained etched in the marrow of New Orleans. The mansion did not rest. Though its timbers were charred and its windows shattered, the Duval house stood stubborn against the years, its blackened shell rising like a sentinel on Royal Street. Neighbors who passed it at dusk swore they felt watched, though no candle glowed behind its broken panes. Some quickened their pace, muttering prayers. Others lingered at the gates, daring themselves to listen. What they heard was not silence. It was something worse, the faint creak of chains when no wind stirred, the rasp of breath behind walls long emptied, the suggestion of whispers curling through soot, dark corridors. For a time the ruin was left untended, a scar no one wished to touch. Grass pushed up between the cobblestones of the courtyard, ivy crawled greedily along scorched brick, and stray cats prowled through the wreckage, their cries echoing like lamentations. The city, ashamed yet unwilling to raise the place, treated it as one might a grave, something to be avoided, though always remembered. Children crossed themselves when they passed. Drunks shouted Celestine's name at its gates and swore they heard her laugh back. But New Orleans was a city that could not resist spectacle. Soon, the ruin became more than a memory. It became an attraction. Carriages slowed so visitors might peer at the charred balconies. Foreign travelers demanded directions, eager to glimpse the place of whispered horrors. Some dared to slip inside, bribing guards or creeping through gaps in the wall. By daylight, they reported the house smelled of smoke and damp earth, of rot mingled with something metallic, faint but insistent. By night, their stories grew stranger. One swore he saw footprints in the dust that vanished as he followed them. Another claimed a window slammed shut, though no glass remained in its frame. Stories multiplied. The house was said to weep on humid nights, beads of moisture forming along its bricks as though it still sweated out the fire. In autumn, when fog rolled low across Royal Street, the ruins seemed to vanish entirely, swallowed whole until only its iron gates protruded like teeth. Some said the gates themselves groaned, not with rust, but as though pushed by unseen hands desperate to flee. Merchants, sensing profit, began selling trinkets said to be forged from the house's nails or carved from its beams. Tour guides, lanterns in hand, wove tales of the cries that once rattled its attic rafters. They embroidered freely. Celestine had dabbled in witchcraft. Celestine had carved her initials into the bones of her captives. Celestine had struck a pact with the devil, her payment sealed in fire. Each retelling blurred fact and fiction until even those who had been present the night of the blaze questioned their memories. Yet beneath the carnival of story, something in the house remained restless. Workers sent to clear debris refused to stay after sundown. They complained of tools vanishing, of ladders that shook violently when no one touched them. One mason claimed he heard singing in the attic, a woman's lullaby, mournful and low. When he followed the sound, he found nothing but an empty beam, charred black and slick with soot. He left before finishing his work and never returned. The city, ever pragmatic, attempted to reclaim the ruin. Plans were drawn to rebuild it as a boarding house, then as a warehouse, then as a theater. Each effort faltered. Workers fell ill, investors withdrew, accidents multiplied. A cart overturned at the gates, crushing a horse. A man tripped on the stairwell and snapped his neck. A wall, half repaired, crumbled suddenly, burying 2 laborers beneath stone. Each misfortune was explained as coincidence, yet the pattern became impossible to ignore. Slowly, the house was abandoned once more, left to brood in silence, and silence was never empty there. Neighbors reported lights flickering within, though no lanterns were hung. Some nights, the mansion exhaled the scent of perfume, heady and cloying, as though Celestine herself had returned to host a gathering. Other nights, the smell was fouler, iron, sweat, smoke, until families along Royal Street shut their windows and prayed aloud. Dogs barked without cause, their hackles rising as they stared at the Duval ruin. Horses shied when led past, their eyes rolling white. It was not only animals who recoiled. Those foolish or brave enough to enter spoke of more tangible terrors. A traveler from Boston claimed he found the walls of the attic slick, not with soot, but with moisture warm to the touch, as though the house itself perspired. A Creole woman, curious to see what others feared, ventured inside with a candle. She swore the flame bent sideways, pulled by a draft that felt like breath upon her neck. She dropped the candle and fled, certain she had heard footsteps behind her. Legends thickened. Some claimed Celestine had not fled at all, but remained bound within the house, her spirit shackled to the very cruelties she had crafted. Others whispered the souls of the captives, denied justice, still roamed the halls, their suffering etched so deeply into the wood and stone that time could not erase it. A few insisted the house itself had become alive, its bricks swollen with agony, its beams humming with despair. To step inside was not to visit a ruin, but to enter a body that remembered every wound. And always there was the carriage. It became the most persistent tale that on storm-tossed nights when lightning forked across the Mississippi, a black carriage clattered down Royal Street, wheels sparking on cobblestones. Witnesses described it the same, horses slick with foam, eyes wild, and within the carriage a veiled woman who never turned her face, though her laughter poured into the night like broken glass. Some swore the carriage never touched the ground, that it hovered a breath above the stones, its wheels spinning without sound until the crack of thunder carried it away. By the close of the century, the Duval house was no longer merely a ruin. It was a mirror in which the city saw both its past and its hunger for story. Historians argued, priests condemned, children dared, and merchants profited. But no matter how many words were written or coins exchanged, the house resisted closure. It stood still, blackened and hollow, its silence heavier than any sermon, its whispers louder than any pamphlet. The ruin endured because it was more than stone. It was memory, chained and restless, waiting. The years passed, but the ruin on Royal Street did not soften. Its jagged frame stood as though scorched into permanence, each window a socket from which no light would shine. Children who had once whispered its stories grew into adults who repeated them to their own children, and so the Duval mansion passed from rumor into legend. Yet for all its notoriety, the house refused to rest quietly in the realm of memory. It pressed itself upon the present, demanding to be felt, to be feared. The black carriage became its herald. It was first written of in 1839 in a diary kept by a seamstress named Mariette. She noted that on a night of heavy rain she heard hooves striking the stones, though the street below her window was already drowned in flood water. Pulling her shutters aside, she saw a carriage gliding through the storm. It left no ruts in the mud, no splashes in the pools, only sparks of light where its wheels struck the stones. Within, she glimpsed a woman's hand, pale as wax. The fingers adorned with rings she swore matched those once owned by Celestine Duval. Her account was dismissed as fevered imagination, yet others followed. A merchant returning from the port in 1008, 142 claimed the carriage overtook him, though he had heard no approach, its horses silent but for the clatter of their hooves, their bodies glistening though the night was dry. A group of sailors swore the same in 1008, 147, describing a veiled woman whose laughter pierced the mist. By the 1008, 150s, the carriage had become a fixture of the city's nocturnal landscape. Few claimed to have seen it with their own eyes, but all knew someone who had. Patterns emerged. The carriage was said to appear most often in April, the month the fire had consumed the house. Some claimed its horses foamed at the mouth, their eyes bloodshot, as though driven beyond exhaustion. Others whispered that if one dared to stand in its path, the carriage would pass straight through flesh and bone without slowing, leaving behind the icy sensation of chains dragging across the skin. New Orleans, a city steeped in both Catholic ritual and Vodou belief, did not treat such reports lightly. Priests were summoned to bless the ruin. Salt was scattered at its gates. Candles burned in windows opposite, their flames guttering as though some invisible breath sought to extinguish them. Yet still the carriage returned, its presence growing more elaborate with each generation. By the 1860s, it was said that the veiled woman sometimes removed her covering. Those who saw her face claimed it bore no flesh, only bone blackened by smoke, her sockets glowing faintly as though lit by coals. The legends crept beyond the house, infecting the quarter itself. Tavern keepers told of shadows that stretched the wrong way at night, crawling toward the Duval ruin even when the moon lay behind them. Seamstresses muttered of mannequins shifting when left alone, their glass eyes turning toward Royal Street. Musicians swore that certain notes, when played near the house, echoed with an extra voice, thin and quavering, as though another instrument played beneath their own. The attic became a particular point of obsession. Though boarded, the windows were said to glow faintly some nights, not with fire but with a steady red pulse, like a coal refusing to die. Boys dared one another to press their ears against the blackened wood. Some ran shrieking, claiming they heard groans. Others insisted they heard the clatter of chains or the scrape of iron across stone. One child never returned at all, vanishing in 1871. His friends swore he had gone to test his courage against the Duval gates. No trace of him was found, though the next morning a small shoe was discovered just inside the courtyard. The ruin's pull extended further as the century wore on. Scholars arrived, eager to separate history from superstition. They measured beams, catalogued bricks, and compared testimonies. Yet even these men, armed with notebooks and skepticism, left with shaken hands. One wrote of hearing someone whisper his name, though no one stood near. Another described finding a page of his notes written over by a hand not his own, the words "Ils brûlant encore." They still burn, scrawled in soot, black strokes. It was as though the house resisted being studied, refusing to be reduced to ink and paper. What had once been rumor was now performance, a haunting enacted upon anyone who dared to treat it as relic. By the 1880s, the Duval mansion was no longer merely a site of atrocity. It was a stage upon which the city's own guilt and fascination played endlessly, each generation adding another act. Some claimed that the carriage was not an apparition but a warning, a rehearsal of Celestine's flight. Each appearance was said to presage calamity, fire, flood, yellow fever. Indeed, those who tracked the sightings noted unsettling coincidences. The carriage was seen in 1853, just weeks before the Great Cholera outbreak. It reappeared in 1862, the very year Union troops seized the city. Again in 1878, on the eve of the devastating yellow fever epidemic. Whether coincidence or curse, the pattern lodged itself into the city's memory. When thunder rolled and the sound of hooves carried over wet stone, hearts clenched, awaiting disaster. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Duval ruin was no longer spoken of as simply haunted. It was described as hungry. Guides whispered that the house consumed stories as eagerly as it once consumed bodies. The more it was spoken of, the stronger it grew. To ignore it was to allow it to fade. To name it, however, was to feed it, and so New Orleans, addicted to its own tales, kept feeding it still. And in the center of it all, the carriage still passed, wheels striking sparks, the veiled woman's laughter cutting through the night. No one asked any longer whether it was real. Reality was not the measure. The carriage had become inevitable, as woven into the life of the quarter as the bells of St. Louis or the fog rising off the Mississippi. It was not merely a ghost. It was the city's confession, rolling ceaselessly down Royal Street. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the Duval mansion had taken on a life of its own. The ruin was less a building than a wound, raw and unhealed, festering in the heart of Royal Street. Even when rebuilt in part, its walls refused to stand innocently. Fresh plaster flaked, new beams warped, colors dulled prematurely. Those who tried to make it a home again fled within months, sometimes days. It seemed the house rejected habitation, as though it demanded emptiness in which to echo. The stories had grown darker. No longer was it merely the phantom carriage or the muffled chains that terrified. Witnesses now spoke of figures glimpsed at windows, pale faces pressed against the glass, mouths moving silently. Some swore they recognized them, recalling the names of servants once catalogued in the Duval inventories, names otherwise forgotten by time. A seamstress crossing Royal Street late one evening claimed she saw 3 women peering from the top window, their eyes glistening wet, as though still waiting for rescue. Inside, the air grew hostile. Builders and renovators complained of dizziness, sudden weakness of the knees, and the overwhelming sense that someone stood just behind them. Tools vanished, only to reappear hours later in improbable places, handles slick with moisture though no rain had touched them. A mason, hired to shore up the collapsing staircase in 1891, left after only 2 nights, swearing he had woken to the sensation of a rope tightening across his chest. When his companions found him the next morning, he bore dark welts, as though from shackles. The city had grown more modern, but superstition clung like ivy. Some whispered that Celestine Duval had not fled far, that she had never boarded a ship to Europe at all, but lingered in the countryside, her wealth protecting her until age claimed her. Others argued she had never died at all, that what people glimpsed in the carriage was no ghost but Celestine herself, preserved by some pact or by the curse of her own cruelty. Yet the strangest whispers suggested that the house itself had become her body, that each groan of its timbers was her sigh, each flicker of its windows her eyes opening, each chain dragged in the attic her restless step. In this telling, the carriage was not escape but return, her endless circuit back to Royal Street, replaying the night she slipped through fire and fury. April 1894 brought the most chilling report. A group of young men, emboldened by wine and bravado, broke into the ruin on the anniversary of the fire. They carried lanterns, laughing as they stumbled up the charred stairwell. According to one who survived, their laughter stopped when they reached the attic door. Though the wood was swollen and half rotted, the lock gleamed new as though polished daily. They forced it open. What they found was not ruin but order. Chains hung from beams, not rusted but shining, as though freshly forged. Straw lay scattered across the floor, yet it smelled not of dust but of rot. In one corner stood a chair fitted with straps, its leather cracked yet still supple. The air was heavy, metallic, and warm, though the night outside was cool. One swore the straw shifted, as though something writhed just beneath it. Another insisted he saw a figure crouched in the farthest corner, its skin stretched tight over bones, eyes glimmering with a wet hunger. The survivors fled before their lanterns could gutter out. By dawn, one had vanished entirely, his boots left behind at the threshold. The 2 who returned told their tale only once, in hushed, broken sentences. Neither lived long. One drowned in the river within the month, the other hanged himself before the year was out. Their story might have died with them, but whispers carried, and before long, April nights were avoided by even the bravest. The ruin had shifted. No longer was it only memory. It had become active, present, its cruelties rehearsed again. Passers-by swore they heard screams carried on the wind, though no one dared linger to confirm. Chains rattled openly, not in secret corners but across the very street. Carriages swerved violently, horses refusing to pass the gates. The house had grown bold, no longer content to haunt its own chambers, but extending its grasp outward, seeping into the quarter. The Duval mansion was no longer a relic, it was a participant. Priests, once willing to mutter blessings at its gates, refused to approach. Vodou practitioners declared it beyond cleansing, its soil soaked too deeply with blood. Even skeptics faltered, unable to deny the mounting accounts, the consistency of details from mouths that never met. The house had achieved something rare. It was not a ghost, nor a myth, nor merely a crime scene. It was all three at once, fused into something larger, and yet the city did not abandon it. The ruin became a magnet. Tourists pressed close, eager to brush against its infamy. Writers and journalists came, scribbling accounts to feed distant readers. Guides led whispered tours past its gates, promising a glimpse of the carriage at midnight. Every telling, every repetition fed it. The Duval mansion drank words as eagerly as it once drank screams. And with each retelling, its power grew more undeniable. By the final years of the century, the house had ceased to be just haunted. It was now believed cursed in a deeper way, to endure forever as testimony, to remind the city of what had been allowed, what had thrived in lace and pearls unchecked. Its walls were no longer merely bricks. They were pages, each scar a sentence, each shadow a confession. And in the streets, when the April nights came damp and unsettled, the black carriage still rolled. Its wheels rattled on stones, sparks striking, hooves pounding though no horses breathed. Sometimes the curtains parted, revealing the veiled woman within, a hand, pale and jeweled, pressed to the glass. Sometimes she waved, sometimes she pointed, and once, according to a sailor who swore the tale until his dying day, she smiled, her teeth black with soot, her lips burned away, her eyes alight with endless fire. The city could no longer deny it. The haunting had grown too large. It was no longer legend, it was presence, and it demanded to be remembered. By the dawning years of the new century, the Duval mansion had settled into its second life. It was no longer merely a ruin, nor only a haunted house. It had become a pilgrimage site for those who craved terror. The city, unwilling yet unable to erase it, left it standing. Its facade bore the weather like an old wound, blistering in summer heat, sweating with mildew in the damp winter, never quite collapsing but never restored to wholeness. Visitors arrived by lantern light, clutching their guides' arms as they crossed Royal Street. Tour conductors whispered of the attic where chains once clinked, of the fire that tore refinement away to reveal rot. Some wept at the telling, though whether from fear or fascination none could say, and each group, after the story was done, lingered just long enough to see if the black carriage would appear. A few swore it did, a rolling silhouette, wheels sparking, curtains fluttering to reveal a pale face within. Others saw only shadows and laughed it off. Yet every April, as the anniversary neared, the tales multiplied. The house fed on attention. It grew bold with every retelling. Where once it clung to silence and secrecy, it now demanded an audience. Those who passed too close found themselves pursued by sounds, the clink of shackles matching their footsteps, the rasp of a woman's breath against their ear, the sudden eruption of laughter high and brittle. A merchant walking home at dusk reported a hand grabbing his sleeve, though no one stood near him. He staggered into the street, only to find faint bruises blooming on his wrist in the shape of long, skeletal fingers. Priests were summoned again, not once, not twice, but many times. Latin was spoken in its halls, incense swung from brass chains, holy water splashed upon scorched stone, yet no prayer took root. The air remained heavy, foul with the scent of burned wood and something deeper, blood, perhaps, though none dared to name it. One priest, young and arrogant, declared he would spend the night in the attic to prove it powerless. By morning he was gone. His cot lay undisturbed, his Bible open on the floor, but no trace of him was ever found. The church forbade further attempts. Whispers returned instead to other rites. Voodoo queens lit candles and traced V's on the pavement outside. They spoke of appeasement, of asking the spirits to calm the fury that lived inside those walls. But the house had no interest in appeasement. Each offering curdled. Each candle blew out before its flame caught steady. It seemed that whatever dwelled within was not merely the spirits of the wronged but something else, something born of cruelty so concentrated it had become its own presence, a dark offspring of suffering. The attic was said to breathe, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech, but literally. Those who crept close to the ruined door felt air exhaling warm across their skin, as though lungs filled and emptied within. At night, faint sobs drifted down the staircase, sometimes broken by laughter. And when the wind howled, neighbors swore the shutters moved not with the gusts but against them, opening wide when the storm pressed them closed. In 1904, a fireman was called after smoke was seen rising from the roof. Expecting embers, he mounted the stairs with his lantern. He returned pale and trembling, unable to speak for hours. When he finally stammered out words, they chilled every listener. It is still burning up there, but the fire is not fire, it is screams. He left his position and never returned to the quarter again. The mansion was no longer content with isolation. It extended its grasp. Houses nearby began to falter. Families on Royal Street reported nights of unrest, dreams of chains rattling against their bedposts, or visions of a woman in lace watching silently from their doorways. Children woke screaming, unable to describe the figure at the foot of their beds, though their drawings, shaky charcoal sketches, always showed the same veiled woman, eyes like hollow pits. Even the ground seemed tainted. Plants withered quickly in the soil nearest the mansion, their roots curling as though scorched. Cats avoided the street, dogs barked frantically when dragged past. One mule collapsed and refused to rise until whipped half to death, its eyes rolling white as it foamed at the mouth. Carriage drivers no longer approached, forcing visitors to walk blocks if they sought to glimpse the cursed facade. The city debated demolition. Some argued it must be pulled down brick by brick, the rubble buried outside New Orleans, salted over to erase its stain. Others protested, pointing to the money its infamy brought from curious travelers. But the fiercest voices warned that tearing down the house would not end its hold. It is not in the wood or the brick. One old guide hissed, "It is in the ground, it is in the air. Destroy the house and it will only find another face to wear." So the mansion endured, hollow half, renovated, abandoned, reoccupied briefly and abandoned again. Each cycle ended the same: screams in the night, chains rattling, figures glimpsed, tenants fleeing. By now, no one pretended Celestine Duval would return in flesh, yet her shadow ruled the street. Some claimed she walked openly, a veiled woman slipping from alley to alley, her perfume cloying sweet. Others swore her laugh rang out from balconies, though no figure could be found above. And always, in April, the carriage returned. Some years it thundered loud, wheels striking sparks as if announcing its passage. Other years it glided silently, curtains closed, only the faintest shimmer of lamplight on its surface revealing its form. Children dared each other to chase it, but the wiser pulled them back. The carriage was no ghostly illusion. Those who touched it never returned. Royal Street had become its stage, the city its witness. And still the wound deepened, never healing, never closing. By the turn of the century, New Orleans no longer asked whether the mansion was cursed. That was beyond question. The only question that remained was whether the curse belonged to the house, or whether it belonged to the city itself, a punishment for silence, complicity, and admiration lavished on cruelty too long ignored. The Duval mansion did not answer. It only stood blackened and patient, its windows empty, its doors gaping like a mouth, and every soul who passed it knew the same truth. The story was not finished. Not yet. The ruin still stands, not in the grandeur that once marked its facade, nor in the splendor Celestine Duval had so carefully cultivated, but as a carcass half-consumed, stubbornly resisting the grave. Its shutters hang like eyelids too weary to close. Its walls lean inward as though burdened with the weight of memory. No one calls it by its rightful name anymore. To the city it is simply the house, and every soul knows which house is meant. By the 1920s, when the French Quarter began to polish itself for tourists, efforts were made once more to rehabilitate the ruin. Workmen set scaffolds, carried timbers, spoke of turning the mansion into apartments or perhaps a boarding house. They lasted no longer than those before them. Nails slipped, hammers struck flesh instead of wood, ropes frayed, ladders pitched sideways without cause. One worker fell from the attic window and shattered on the street below. The coroner's report noted not merely broken bones but ligature marks on his wrists, though he had worn no ropes. The scaffolding was abandoned the very next day. By mid-century, the city gave up its struggle. The mansion remained untouched, while the quarter bustled around it. Its windows stared blankly at jazz clubs and neon signs, its blackened bones unsoftened by the bright gaiety of the age. Photographs taken by visitors captured strange fogs curling across its steps or pale shapes in upper windows. One tourist's camera snapped an image of a veiled woman standing perfectly still behind a pane of cracked glass. No figure was visible to the naked eye at the time. The film was tested repeatedly. No trick could explain it. Neighbors spoke less often of screams, though not because they had ceased. Instead, they learned to ignore them, to fold them into the noise of the quarter. At night, when revelers shouted in the street, the house's own cries were masked. Yet in the still hours before dawn, the difference could be felt. Those who lived nearby told of waking with breath caught in their throats, an invisible weight pressing them down. More than one neighbor moved away after reporting dreams of fire, of chains biting into their flesh, of a carriage waiting endlessly at the door. The legend thickened into ritual. Tour guides stopped at the gates and spun their tales, their lanterns glowing against the ruin's walls. They spoke of the fire of 1834, the attic of torment, the vanished mistress. Their voices dropped as they reached the climax, and inevitably someone in the crowd looked upward toward the attic windows. More often than not, they swore they saw a movement there, a shadow gliding, a pale hand brushing aside tattered curtains, a face veiled, watching. The house had become profitable, yet its profit was never wholly safe. Guides confessed in hushed voices that sometimes after speaking its story aloud, they found themselves followed home, not by footsteps on cobblestone, but by whispers at their ear, the rustle of silk just behind them. One guide, bold enough to scoff, vanished after a late tour. His lantern was found smashed at the corner of Royal Street. His body was never recovered. The city, as cities do, learned to live with its wound. The Duval mansion became a fixture, a reminder, a story to sell alongside music and drink. But beneath the commerce, the deeper truth remained. It was not empty. It had never been empty. Scholars wrote of it in dry tones. Articles appeared in local journals, cataloging its architecture, its owners, its fires. Some argued the stories of cruelty were exaggerated, a blend of gossip and racial prejudice. Yet no amount of academic language could erase the testimonies of those who had seen the shackles, who had carried broken bodies into the street, and no analysis could dismiss the reports that continued, fresh each decade, of cries, of laughter, of figures glimpsed. By the end of the 20th century, the house was as famous as it was feared. Its ruinous walls adorned postcards, its story adapted into books, films, whispered tales passed in bars. Yet those who dared to linger longest at its gates swore the air itself pressed colder there, as though the ruin resented the commodification of its pain. It doesn't want to be a story, one guide confessed after quitting. It wants to be lived, it wants to go on, and perhaps it does, for there are those even now who claim to have seen her, not merely the house, not merely its shadows, but Celestine Duval herself, a veiled woman stepping from a carriage that makes no sound, a figure gliding through Jackson Square, her gown trailing though her feet do not touch the ground, a face at the window, pale and calm, watching the living with patient eyes, always the veil, always the faint scent of burning silk. The ruin stands because the story is not over. The city could demolish it tomorrow, scatter its bricks, salt the earth. Yet those who know whisper that the house would not die. It would simply shift, perhaps to another corner of the quarter, perhaps to another mansion whose elegance conceals its own rot. For cruelty, this deep leaves a stain that stone cannot hold alone. So the mansion waits, as it has waited for nearly 2 centuries. Its doors gape, its windows stare, and every April, when the fire is remembered, the screams return as fresh as the night they first poured into the street. Walk past if you like, pause at the gate. Listen closely. You may hear the rattle of chains or the thud of fists upon a locked door. If you are very unlucky, you may hear the wheels of a carriage approaching, though no horses draw it. Should you see its curtain lift, do not look inside. And if you smell burning silk, do not breathe.